Off. Okay, welcome again to the Memory Poets Translating the Archive into New Forms event. This event is framed around the question, how can poetry translate the past? Each of these poets are interested through different means and from different vistas in the archive, family archives, national archives, archives of violence, of joy, of objects, and the ways in which the poet can hold and shift landscapes of power, politics, and memory by revisiting the past. I'm going to begin the event today by reading a very short poem, I Couldn't Resist, by M. Norbese Philip, which I think will open the space to the kind of worlds and words that we're about to encounter, that these poets are about to give us. So I'll read the short poem. It's from Norbese Philip's book, She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks, from 1989. And the poem is called Sightings. Nose to ground, on all fours, I did once smell that smell. On a day of once upon a time, tropic with blue, when the new, newer, and newest of leaves compete. In the season of suspicion she passed, then and ago trailed the wet and lost of smell. Was it a trompe l'oeil, the voice of her sound, or didn't I once see her song, hear her image call me by name, my name, another sound, a song, the name of me we knew she named, the sound of song sung long past time. As I cracked from her shell, the surf of surge, the song of birth. A beautiful poem, and here to give us, I think, some of this sound of song sung long past time, which is just a stunning line, are Tirzah Goldenberg and Cynthia Dewi Oka. I'll introduce both of them, and then I'll turn things over to each poet who will one by one read for us and talk a little bit about their poetics and their work, and then we'll open things for discussion. So please feel free at any time to write your questions or comments in the Q&A, and we'll discuss them in the later half of the program. I'll start with Tirzah Goldenberg. Tirzah Goldenberg was raised in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, in an Orthodox Jewish community, spent her college years in England at the University of Exeter, received her MFA in poetry from Colorado State University, and now lives on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, on the traditional homelands of the S'Klallam people, where she works as a freelance editor. She's the author of Olive, published by Verge Books in 2017, and Like an Olive by the same press in 2022. She is also co-author with Norman Finkelstein of 36/2 Lives, a Poetic Dialogue, published by Dos Madres Press in 2021. Her work has appeared in West Branch, Cutbank, Salt, Dispatches from the Poetry Wars, Flag and Void, Arochts, and Erasio Poetry Journal, among others. New work will be appearing in From a Compost and in a folio featuring contemporary Jewish poets in a special issue of the Laurel Review. And Cynthia. Originally from Bali, Indonesia, Cynthia Dewi Oka is the author of 4 books of poems, most recently A Tinderbox in 3 Acts, a Blessing the Boats selection chosen by Araceli Skirmai, published by Boa Editions in 2022, and Fire is Not a Country, published by Northwestern University Press in 2021. A recipient of the Amy Clampett Residency, Tupelo Quarterly Poetry Prize, and the Leeway Transformation Award, her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Oprah Daily, Poetry, Academy of American Poets, Poetry Society of America, Hyperallergic, and elsewhere. An alumnus of the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers, she has taught creative writing at Bryn Mawr College, New Mexico State University, Blue Stoop, and Voices of Our Nation. For 15 years, Cynthia served social movements for racial, gender, climate, and migrant justice as an organizer, trainer, and fundraiser. Based in Los Angeles, she currently serves as faculty in the writers program at UCLA Extension and editor-in-chief of Addie Magazine. So we'll start, I think, by welcoming Tirzah Goldenberg to give us some of her work. We're very lucky to have these poets here, so thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel, for having me. It's lovely to be here. I think I'll begin by reading a few artifact poems. I tend to write shorter poems featuring artifacts or heirlooms, I think because they speak so eloquently about loss. They've survived, but they're also secretive, opaque, descendants in some sense of their original contexts. They hold a power for me not unlike that of the Jewish ritual objects that furnished my childhood. The material opens spiritual and emotional dimensions in my work. And I think I know a poem is complete when it's equal parts there and not there, much like the artifact itself. Heirloom Tehillim preserve with ciphers, elfin tefillin prefigure by binding remains. Anachronism inlay like a tincture, to hand, to head, to heart. Here, here, and over here, with parchment the quiet, Lee written for, the protean unspoken folklore, altar, the antique at the altar, forget like a master, like an extant fragment, remember, God's old signature, or life breath be. The letters are plain furnishing, files for quickening, bellows before hearth, faulty and likely to be all clarity, altering round feeling a while, the Jew the while altering. Archaeologists depend on material culture. All our hopes for something inscribed. The more unprovenanced, the better. Different from what anyone supposed and luckier. In an earlier era, we picked up today's exegetical remarks. Emotional about the material of verbal era. The remains of anything belonging to the rebels. Her sandals near to, her braided hair. The earthly, angelic liturgy. Their bones and their bones of holy scrolls, our talismans, our drawn lots, our fruits, olives to olives in the hidden press, figs pressed to figments, dates to dates of Shabbos moons, to sing like the angels, rebels biyachad, early Hebrew, ostraca. I'll now read excerpts from a longer prose piece called Composite Proof Texts 2, and this needs a bit of an introduction. It's composed of the autobiographical material of two of my ancestors, my maternal great-grandmother, whose name was Anne Jurup, and my paternal grandfather, Rabbi Bernard or Benjamin Goldenberg. I knew him as Saba, the Hebrew word for grandfather. My great-grandmother Anne was born in Pennsylvania the daughter of immigrants from Norway and Denmark, and my grandfather, or Saba, emigrated from Poland to the US as a child. Anne's material comes from a short 20-page memoir she wrote about her childhood, which includes some information about previous generations in Scandinavia. And my Saba's stories come from a taped interview that my mother, his daughter-in-law, conducted with him in the 1990s in my grandparents' apartment in Jerusalem. What I've done is alternate excerpts from these source texts as if one side were the warp and the other the weft, or as if one side were the printed parts and one side the unprinted parts of a woodcut. This piece is commentary on my family background. My mother converted to Judaism, and I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish environment. As my mother has explained to me, after she converted to Orthodoxy, she didn't talk about the conversion. Her life prior to that moment, in some sense, disappeared. Instead, she tried to blend in with the culture she'd chosen. This silenced her origins. As a descendant of such a conversion and as a poet, I feel that I'm now doing the work of unblending so that I can integrate my mom's complete story into my own Jewish identity. The seeds for my mom's conversion were planted early. Her mother, my grandmother, the daughter of Anne Jurup, was thinking of converting to Judaism herself, though she ultimately chose Episcopalianism. Her closest friends were Jewish. She had a Jewish boyfriend at one time. She took my mom to her first Seder and to a synagogue, where my mom, at the age of 7 or 8, ran down the aisle toward the Torah when the Ark was opened. My grandmother insisted that her daughters watch documentaries on the Holocaust, and she would always say, 6 million Jews, 1 million children, and the world did nothing. My mom has been involved with the Holocaust Research Project Transcending Trauma for the past 25 years. And so I've had the revelation in recent years that my Judaism comes down to me through both my maternal and paternal sides for generations. And importantly, my mother is the archivist of these 2 stories I'm about to read excerpts from. It was she who asked her grandmother Anne to write down her life before she died, and it was she who interviewed my father's father and recorded his legacy. And so what's also preserved in the end are these acts of preservation. The year of my birth was 1918. The town is Lumja, Poland. I would say half the population was Jewish. I was born in Derby, PA on October 18, 1892. My father's name was Gershon. My mother's name was Gittel. My mother, Ingeborg Tuv, was born in a town in the Lofoten Islands in Norway. For 6 months of the year, the sun doesn't set, and all lamps and candlesticks are put away. My oldest sister was Chaya. In my time in Lumja, she was married to someone by the name of Pasmanek, who had a printing shop. She had 2 children. They were all killed in the Holocaust. For years, we would all get together and weave baskets for our Christmas trees. My father filled our baskets with chocolates, and each guest who came to see us received one. This is one of my very happy memories. I remember the central market in Lumja, which was, let's say, a little bit like Machane Yehuda here in Jerusalem. They would skate for miles on the frozen fjords and all go home for hot chocolate. My grandmother always hated northern Norway. She hated the long, cold winters and the poverty. We have a handmade steel darning needle, which a woman who had no money gave my grandmother for a little salt. Otherwise, I have absolutely no memory of Lumja as such. Sociologically speaking, The anti-Semitism, the hatred against Jews, of course, was very pronounced in Europe. And America was always the golden land. In Yiddish, they said the Goldene Medina. My grandfather had a hotel and kept saying, "What are you staying on in Poland for? Why don't you come to America?" Before we leave Norway, I must tell you about my great-grandmother. She lived to be 103 years old. One day she didn't wake up. Wasn't that a wonderful way to live and die? The quota on immigration was such where only certain people were allowed to come in. That was a little bit traumatic. My parents went first. I remember going on the boat and finally arriving in America and meeting my parents and meeting Herman. They changed my name from Benjamin to Bernard, incidentally, to make me more American. We lived on the wrong side of the tracks. I remember crossing the tracks every day to go to the public school. My father was educated in private schools. After the gymnasium, he, like all gentlemen's sons, was sent on a cruise on a sailing training ship, where they were taught everything about a ship, even the names of each little piece of rope. My grandfather, he was the one that opened the first Gemara for me. I remember how I sat down with him and learned the first Gemara. After the cruise, he went to the University of Copenhagen and became a chemist. He sailed for America on the same ship where my grandmother, mother, and Uncle Fred. They sent me away to New York to go to a place called Yeshiva Torah Voda'as. I lived with an aunt of mine. It was one of those railroad flats on the east side. Mother and father were married in New York. Father gave me the ring for an heirloom. He couldn't speak English. He wasn't versed in that business. Of what use is he? The question occurs to me, of what use was he? When I was 1 year old, they moved to 347 Snyder Avenue in Phila. This was much nearer the Penn Salt. When I was 2 years old, Mother took me to Denmark to be christened. There's a picture on the table of Mother and me the day I was christened. He's really one of the heroes of that generation of American Jews who stuck with the Torah rather than give it up, which really should be enshrined in a book. Dropping, 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 here the pennies fall. Every one for Jesus, he will get them all. The East Side in those days had bookstores, loads of bookstores, famous East Broadway and Canal Street. So I went to the East Side. I bought a set of Yavets. When Father went on his annual trip to Greenland to put a price on a cargo of cryolite for the Danish government and the Aluminum Company of America, he was gone for a long time. But also we got documents about the war years, etc., before we knew about the gas chambers, etc. Every time she moved, there were the footsteps. For once in her life, she was terrified. As she started down the steps, she discovered that a spool of thread was caught in the bottom of her long skirt. We tried and there was nowhere news. Then we heard from others that the Lumja ghetto was totally liquidated. Nothing ever came up. They were all liquidated. We have the date written down somewhere. They were killed in the ghetto. I used the Asara B'Teves yard site for it. So we moved to a new house in South Philadelphia. Across the street were acres of ground owned by an old Phila family. On this particular piece of land, they raised thousands of beautiful peonies, which were a joy to all of us, especially my mother. Why don't you take a look what happened with the Holocaust? Take a look, there's nothing left. What do you want to do in America? There will be nothing left here either. Therefore, you have to start building day schools. This is a Jew talking to you. You East Sider, you Jew, you New Yorker, you communist, you, get out of my town. Orthodoxy as such was not accepted. Everyone felt that orthodoxy is going out in the 60s. Finished. What's left of orthodoxy? Here there was a chance with the help of God.
Thank you so much, Tirzah. Such beautiful words, so much to think about. And I think the words bring us beautifully to Cynthia's work. A poem is complete when it's equal parts there and not there, like the artifact. I think we'll be returning to this idea of the artifact and the heirloom. So thank you. Next, I'll introduce Cynthia Dewi Oka, who I introduced at the beginning. Please welcome Cynthia. And let's see. I'll pin you.
Thank you so much, Tirzah. And thank you, Rachel, for having us. Thank you all for being here. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great.
Yes.
I think, because the panel is called Memory Poets, I started thinking about, what is memory? Like, how do I think about what memory actually is? So maybe I think I'll structure my time that way. I'll read a couple of pieces, but also talk through some of I think like what's beautiful about making a work is that the work is also available for us to kind of open and reopen again as our lives evolve, as we evolve. I'll probably start with this piece here, and then I'll share a little bit of context. So the first thing that my first thesis about memory is that memory is social. It requires both the writer and the reader, or the rememberer, and someone who is willing to say, I believe you. Where are the marches? Where have I been? In the daily lived sense, we encounter each other as wet or rugged, dangerous or miraculous, but always opaque surfaces. Communication is a bare need to explain ourselves to each other, to explain ourselves to ourselves. For this reason, I suspect lies live longer than bombs. When offends me, I approach with fear because I must. I carry fear like teeth in my head. Grinding is the work of forgetting until the text is in our stomach, seeps into our heartbeat. And then nothing of ours is denied the text. In this sense, reading might be more dangerous than writing. In the flame that sits in the box of human wire, many writers have been lost to the air that is also lost. Not because they wrote, but because someone might read what they wrote. The reader may have choices the writer does not. In this sense, the reader may be the true agent of history. I wrote a tinderbox in 3 acts several years ago. It was done actually for a few years before I decided to explore looking for a home for it. And I feel very grateful for BOA for publishing it. But one of the reasons that I really struggled with that decision is the why I wrote the book. So the book deals with the 1965 genocide in Indonesia, which, is very, very little known in the world. It was suppressed by our own government. The Indonesian military and paramilitaries killed anywhere between 500,000 to 3 million people in Indonesia, completely wiped out progressive forces in the country. It was not just members of the Communist Party who were targeted, but also we had the largest, one of the largest women's rights movements in the world in the 1960s, and it was completely wiped out. And in fact, women were deployed as the scapegoats, as the reason why, you know, these forces needed to be banished from the land. This was kind of like at the height also of the Cold War, of competing influences between communism and capitalism, the West and versus Russia, China, etc., of course. And Indonesia kind of got caught in the middle of it as part of the strategy of containment that the US was pursuing in Asia Pacific. And landless peasants, union organizers, students, artists. We had an entire brilliant movement of artists, dancers, writers, scholars, whose lives were erased. Many of them ended up, if not disappeared, then in detention and or silenced, banned effectively for the rest of their lives. And in place of this void that happened, this massive erasure that took place across the country, touched everybody, you know, because people lost neighbors, relatives, children, parents, of course, and one of the things being that the military, the Indonesian government incentivized ordinary people to kill each other. So in the aftermath of all of this loss, there wasn't just silence. There wasn't just, okay, now we're not going to talk about this. In the aftermath of it, the Indonesian government created a narrative about who the bad guys were and who the good guys were. And essentially the perpetrators of the genocide became venerated as national heroes. One of them, the man who spearheaded the campaign to exterminate these people in my country, became our second president. Suharto, he was the head of the New Order regime, which was in power for 30 plus years. We are continuing as a diaspora, as also people who still live in Indonesia, as Indonesians everywhere are still dealing with the legacy of that. And one of the challenges, I think, for me, as someone who was born under the New Order, so I was born in 1985 when Suharto was still in power. I spent the first 10 years of my life in Indonesia under the dictatorship. Was essentially, you know, what happens when a narrative replaces a memory? Right. So it's not like we're not just trying to remember, we're also having to contest a narrative that prevents remembering. And so out of that kind of question, this project was born. And a deeper question under that that's more personal for me is, you know, is reconciliation possible when alternate versions of what happened is on the table? So I'll read another poem here. This one is just titled Noni. Noni is a common nickname for Chinese Indonesian girls. Chinese Indonesians were also one of the groups targeted during the genocide explicitly because they were accused of having ties with communist China. And my mother was a Chinese foreign national, basically, in Indonesia. Noni. On the train to New York, formerly New Amsterdam, until the Dutch traded it for a speck of nutmeg in the Moluccas held by the English, your head could be a sunflower. Forging a counterposition to ghost, you have not been holding intestines in your hands. A nation is fragile. Your mother buries your father. She made a graph of his fluctuating, but can't say what it means that her children stand crisscrossed by wires, working to accept confinement to a circle, appearing without a light of our own. You read a book and the moon blown up orbits the earth. You play Sibelius's violin concerto to feel unrepentant. Like voices, debris catch fire in the atmosphere. It is time to let the past throw the horn. For geopolitical reasons, a helmet is a hole inside of a hill. When the dream is thwarted, we must make another, says someone who is not your father, to rows of undocumented Indonesians in the wood of a church in Philadelphia. It's true. Nobody ever called back. Though your father sat by the phone for years, this happened not only to you. Nobody could afford to cry in the well. It crouched there, wrinkling at the edges, waiting for the smoke to pass. Sometimes it lived on a rooster's crow that broke down the middle. I started writing this book while I was organizing undocumented Indonesians in Philadelphia under the Trump era, during the Trump era. And one of the very obvious dynamics that I was coming across, that I was faced with, was the continued sort of practices and habits that had been cultivated under the New Order regime, because most of these folks, just like my parents, have spent most of their lives indoctrinated by the dictatorship. So it's incredible fear of political participation, incredible paranoia and mistrust of each other, because we have a history of being incentivized to turn on each other. There was just a kind of constant hum of terror. There was also absurdism. There was surrealism. There was a clinging to any form of authority that felt bigger than us, that was so recognizable to me from my own upbringing. And, you know, it brought me back to when I was growing up. Me and my cousins, we used to ask each other if there was like a curse in the family. It's like, is there a curse? Like, why? And it was a way to ask, like, why was there so much trauma that we were not allowed to talk about, but then also so that we couldn't even name it. We couldn't even name it as trauma. Why was there so much? Why was violence so normalized, and extremism so normalized in our family? Why did it target girls in particular? And in the absence of a context, of a historical context, we couldn't understand. Like, the story was a curse because we didn't have context. Like, you say curse because there's no context. And we couldn't understand where these practices were coming from, where these habits were coming from, why there was so much injury. And I think in part, really, all of us, had our different ways of trying to unpack that. And as a poet, like, this was my way of understanding what is the macro inside of which the micro of the ecosystem of my family was sort of created, it was sort of forged. And a second thesis that I have about memory in this situation is that memory is a draft. You know, it's sort of like, it's the raw materials that we use to build stories, and those stories can be, we're constantly revising the story as well as we change if we are able to, you know, like that line, when a dream is thwarted, you must make another. That was said by an Indonesian pastor in Philly whose congregation was almost entirely undocumented Indonesians. And that was like one of his interventions that he was trying to make is, you know, we get programmed with a narrative that prevents us from remembering things that don't fit with the narrative. And like part of the work has to be able to open us up. Part of the work is to create new dreams, is to create a new narrative, and that allows us to like take in new memories, take in new raw materials, and also to revisit raw materials and rework them. So that's really in that was around the same time in 2017, there was a trove of archives that was released by the US Department of State, about correspondences that tracked the genocide that was unfolding in Indonesia. And my question then, I think, Rachel, you had asked us to talk a little bit about power. And I was thinking, I am still thinking also about like, what is the power of the poet? Because the power of the storyteller is to tell a story. It's to exactly do, you know, to tell that other story. Like, oh, you said this is what happened, I'm saying this is what happened, instead. But what is the power of the poet in relation to memory? And I was called to be a poet in respect to this project, not a storyteller. And I think a poet's power is a poet looks at the pieces. I think broken things are sacred to the poet as broken things. And so there is a kind of resistance also to coherence, which I talk about in this book, and which the book also kind of enacts. We have visual portraits, we have like plays, like, I don't know if you can see it because we have like, this is like one of the portraits that I drew. We have memorandums, we have maps. And I think for me, I was interacting with the archive that I received, which, you know, is in like an American Voice, and trying to break it down to the raw materials, to build a new draft. I wanted to not so much tell another story as really look at what is there. Look at the things that we were not permitted to look at, to give us choices. So like, take back the choice, which is also up to the reader, how you use it, how you interpret it, how you want to revise it, what questions you want to ask. And I think to me, like, that is a reclamation of like small freedoms, you know, like the freedom to ask, the freedom to ask questions, the freedom to grieve, the freedom even to not understand, if that makes sense. So I'll just read one more poem from the book and then I'll pass it on to Vanessa. Let's see. This poem is written in the persona of like the book is written entirely in personas, and one of the personas is based on my father, and this poem is written in his voice. aspirations. At 19, the roads in my oldest brother's lungs narrowed until not the thinnest breath could pass. I didn't know him well. He couldn't go to school with the rest of us, 6 boys in all, and spent most days trading jokes with the becak drivers resting their calves while they smoked clove cigarettes along the city sidewalks. On the day of his funeral, the local Communist Party office closed in his honor. The avenues leading to the cemetery were jammed by hundreds of coolies. I'm not like my brother or my brothers. I like the floors clean, the pantry stocked. On paper, I need to get the lemon yellow right of the parakeets preening themselves in a wooden cage. He was beautiful, I agree. I'm sad in all the ways I am supposed to be sad. Every week, my father, the Marlboro factory king, asks, "What will you become?" I don't think about it like that. Just yesterday, David carried home a fawn in his arms. He said he found her by the side of the road and something in her was broken. She now limps around our backyard, I don't know for how long. He's always rescuing things he forgets. A phonograph in the living room has stayed silent for many months while my mother is writing the German textbook she says will pay for all of us to go to university. What I want to tell her is I saw a swan float past a field of wrecked buffalo, and I heard it in its pale swan voice say, "Come." There are a lot of animals in this world, and I do not like a single one. Another David said, "The hills are where our help comes from." The avenues have emptied. The warehouses are ashes. While my brothers are out patrolling, bats peel themselves from the insides of the earth. In clouds, they explode, a bouquet of black roses, rods in their wings, snagging on moonlight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Beautiful poems like voices debris catch fire. What a beautiful line. And thank you for your questions. Is reconciliation possible? And your theses of memory. We have Tirzah who said the poem can hold the there and the not there. And Cynthia who said the poem can hold broken things as broken things. And I think there's something about the fragment, the silence and the sound. Maybe the poet is holding those raw materials. The draft, the line can hold those raw materials as raw materials. So thank you, Cynthia. We have our last poet. I'll introduce her and then welcome her. Vanessa Angélica Villareal, who was born in the Rio Grande Valley to formerly undocumented Mexican immigrants. She is the author of the poetry collection Beast Meridian, published by Noemi Press in the Acrílica series in 2017, a recipient of a 2019 Whiting Award, a Kate Tufts Discovery Award nomination, and winner of the John A. Robertson Award for Best First Book of Poetry from the Texas Institute of Letters. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine's The Cut, Harper's Bazaar, Oxford American, Paris Review, Poetry Magazine, and elsewhere. She is a recipient of a 2021 National Endowment for the Arts Poetry Fellowship and a doctoral candidate in English Literature and Creative Writing at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she is working on a poetry and an essay collection while raising her son. So please help me welcome Vanessa.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction. And thank you, Cynthia, for that beautiful reading. I actually kind of really wanted to address one of the questions that you asked in what you were talking about in your reading, and it's whether or what memory is, and it's about who is believed. And that's actually something that I've been sort of working through in my essay collection. And there's actually, I wasn't going to read it. I'm still kind of working with it, but I think the occasion kind of calls for it. So I'm going to read just a few essay excerpts that sort of touch on what memory is, what traumatic memory is, and then I'll move into some of the poems that I prepared for today. This first one is called The Blade Between Belief and Disbelief. Magic, like violence, operates in the language of disbelief. This can't be real. I can't believe it. A magician saws a woman in half, then makes her whole again. Unbelievable in more ways than one. At the border, 5,500 migrant children are ripped from their families, the youngest only 4 months old. Tent cities bloom along the wrinkles in the river. Fernanda Jacqueline Davila, a 2-year-old, is unable to testify at her own immigration trial. She is imprisoned. Unthinkable. The story fades. 1,000 children remain separated. A magician cuts a country, a family, a life in half. A magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat. Where did the rabbit come from? Is the hat a portal? Did it materialize out of thin air? How could you do that? A man with an AR-15 sprays over 1,200 rounds per minute into unprotected, vulnerable bodies in an elementary school, a grocery store, a movie theater, a nightclub, a Bible study, a concert, a massage parlor. We stare in utter disbelief. Then accusations that the shootings were staged. False flags with paid crisis actors playing victim. At a magic show, there are 2 types of audience members, those who give themselves totally to the illusion and those who try to figure out the trick. Those who want the lie and those who will not be made fools. Innocence and experience. Magic, like violence, is a fracture in reality that renders 2 incompatible stories unintelligible as coexisting truths. The feeling of the surreal. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, bodies in a box between 2 realities. An unarmed teenager in one reality, a thug in another. Hands up in one reality, only for the ballistics report to put his hands back down again. How needing all of the facts of the situation makes someone no angel. How no fact makes him a demon. The surreal is the presence of 2 realities, that which is possible and that which is impossible coexisting in time, the body cut, the body between cut by a blade. America is a surreal landscape populated by halves. You never know which reality someone exists in, which truth they've chosen. No one agrees on the same past and therefore cannot produce a future. No one can agree they saw the same thing ad infinitum. The telling of history has 2 forms, memory and record. Memory is a ghost that haunts the artifact, disproven, disbelieved to be real, denied its story. To remember and know a history without record is to read the centuries written in the body, to listen to the ghosts in your blood. Perhaps this is magical thinking. Reopen the case. Injustice is the triumph of a false record over a reality now confined to the erasure of memory. When no one believes your reality, you live in a state of magical realism. Newton's apple suspended between falling from the tree and being of the tree. There are names for what the body does when our reality betrays us. Shock, disassociation, post-traumatic stress disorder, mania, psychosis, schizophrenia. But the DSM-5 focuses on the individual, a default white male body standing in the white room of science. What does a fracture in reality do to a collective story, a collective memory, our collective unconscious? Trauma changes your relationship to reality. Once a stable, predictable, knowable thing, bound by physical laws, after trauma, reality is now a fragile, unstable thing that could collapse again at any minute. You lose all sense of the world as it once was. When you lose the world, reality is always unbecoming itself, suspended in time between two futures, the foreclosed future you were headed toward, and the dangerous, uncertain future you are now forced to accept without understanding. Magic, like violence, is the blunt force of someone else's narrative control, the loss of power in your own story. In someone else's reality, your story becomes so unbelievable, so unlikely, the burden of proof falls on you to reclaim the truth. But how can you when the laws of nature no longer hold the world together? Once upon a time, I believed that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Later, I learned about the novel Gravity's Rainbow, named after the arc a rocket traces across the sky before it lands. Both arcs abide by the laws of nature. Both are a state of suspension headed toward different outcomes. I'm no mathematician, but justice, a rainbow, is not a parabola. It is a parable. It is the bending of light, curved as a reflection and refraction of the sun, opposite its place in the sky. A rainbow is a full circle, cut in half by the earth. The rainbow's parable, a covenant with God that never again would life on earth be threatened with total annihilation. Annihilation. A missile is an explosive projectile launched as an act of war. All projectiles follow the curved path of a parabola. After launch, they cover horizontal and vertical distance, but as gravity pulls the projectile down, its horizontal distance begins to arc and bends the path of the projectile into a parabola. Justice is relative, depending on whose narrative becomes history. So those two lyric essays are from my forthcoming essay collection, Magical Realism, which I don't know, it's becoming a lot of things. A book changes. Whatever you think a book is going to be, it's going to have a mind of its own. Okay, I'm going to share my screen so that I can read from some visual poems that address this question of memory. The first one is function equals root future. So the way this poem works, this was intended to be a couple of things. One was a timeline where the prime meridian, the sort of halfway mark that marks the sort of beginning of time in the world, as it stretches over to the Americas, that timeline starts to, it's going toward the past, a futureless past, to sort of make apparent or make physical the sort of like obliterated indigenous memory of the Americas, and the real time going toward the old world as, you know, the established timeline of the West, you know, and all of the things that go along with the established timeline of the West, which is science, progress, capitalism, innovation, whatever it is, and whatever that is leading us to. This is also, so, you know, by putting together like a sort of timeline map of the Americas versus the old world, it's also functioning on set theory, which I knew at the time that I was writing the poem. You know, you get into these like research rabbit holes and then it makes sense and then you forget the thing that you researched. But so all of these calculations are, according to the theory, correct. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just start reading. Year 0, matrilineal equals repeat. Cycle, inherit, does not exist. 0 equals Godman. Blooming ranch fields, a throat packed with cotton, no choice but to marry her eldest off to the hoof-beaten storm. 0, Angélica. Escape the hoof-beaten storm. Escape the garnet-eyed doctor. Escape the stillborn country that pummels you to rags. 0 equals Silvia. English synonyms for future. Escape, amnesty, green card, possibility, dream, I promise, I will, I do, pregnant, labor, indebted, hospitalized, soul, provider, burden, loan, insufficient. 0 equals Vanessa. Witness this pattern now cycling into me. Again, lost eddies of time, lost again. I submerge my body in the river of unclaimed memory. Swim again to its cervix and speak into the sea. I did everything I was supposed to do, and still an unbroken line of broken lines. 1 equals Joaquin. If someone is going to make it out of this dream alive, let it be you unbraiding from me. Let it be that this cord, its arcing line, when viewed from above, is an infinite field. And let the field open for you like a bell, its bend veined with a lace of new stars. And let each new star echo on earth as a blossom, bursting from the black, so that you, born from this blood-dark grief, marbled with error, can still be perfect. Let every good beast carry you in its eye open with wild knowing. And let every sagging telephone line carry my voice to you when I'm gone and when you're lonely or scared. And in a sleep soft drift, you'll think you hear me in the kitchen. And yes, there we are again, reflected in the bend of the steel spoon, the milk still spinning as we lick off the chocolate. And there we are again in the rust-burnt dusk, embers whirling off the mountainside, the last sight we'll have of an ocean. And yes, I'm sorry. I am so, so sorry. What else could I have done to stop the cell from splitting? Year 1, set patrilineal equals new, AD, T equals timeline, D equals discovery. Conquest, 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 conquest. Start chronometer, start collective memory, start archive. Before the ship's arrival, there is no history. Any subject exhibiting any of the following conditions will be removed and denied re-entry into real time. Undocumented, uncivilized, uncontrollable, unskilled, unwell, unaccompanied, unassimilated, uncolonized, unclean, unintelligible, unclaimed, unmarried, unattractive, unbecoming, unemployed, unauthorized, unprofitable, uninsured, underfoot, disabled, disappeared, diseased, disadvantaged, discarded, disassociated, disordered, dissenting, indebted, prehistoric, pre-agricultural, pre-capitalist, pre-discovery, pre-colonial, pre-Christian, primitivity, pre-literate, precarious, prey. Real future function, future times time, discovery times time equals infinity. And after the coral bleaches to bone and the poles thaw and the clouds shatter a searing rain, the SpaceX colony will have already built an electromagnetic wall to border its orbit. And in the field, the bent workers will still scoop tender chard under a burning sky for the empire. And even the mountains will kneel in witness and surrender to the sinking to greet once again that same ancient ocean. And when the last elephant falls, we will know the end of memory. And time will go white, and the future white, and the past white, wiped immaculate of fault. All time collapsed into a single line, all histories consumed by the official record and its impeccable family lines traced back through the whitened field itself so straight, and us broken in broken trees to make way for the future, progressing ever forward in a line of suns. But any voyage that assumes a forward course will loop to its origin and cross itself. And so the compass rose will enclose the world into the shape of a gun sight. And when there are no new lands to map in blood, how pale will the horse of the last sunrise look underwater? Learn from this, little one. Time was never a line, but a field, and you are occurring alongside the past. And when I recognize abuelitos laugh in you, or offer a bending lily to the dead. We are born and together again. And every minute I choose you, choose to fight and don't drive off the mountain. I encounter the infinite as the will to survive. Okay, I think this will be my last poem. So this poem came out of a couple of different things. So I was part of this fellowship called the Art for Justice Fellowship, where we wrote like a mini manuscript, a chapbook of poems against incarceration. And I chose the immigration detention system. We had to do like a lot of like in-person research, but it was in the midst of the pandemic. So unfortunately, I couldn't do any in-person research. When I tried to go to the detention center in downtown LA just to deliver things like basic things like soap, toothpaste, Pampers, diapers, whatever, I was turned away. They weren't even allowing any kind of donations, for basic toiletries for migrants, even, if I offered, for them to inspect them. Same with clothing donations. It was just a really, I think it's like being memory hold now, how desperate and dire the situation was with migrants, and it was really deeply affecting to me. So I began to volunteer for this immigration lawyer in Koreatown, and the majority of what he needed me to do was to go through these spreadsheets that were just incredibly depersonalized, and I had to look for like these sort of like red flags. And so, this is actually just taken, this is not taken from any of the spreadsheets I was looking at. Those I had to destroy. This is a declassified spreadsheet that's similar to the ones that I was looking at. It was declassified by ICE. And this is what parole hearing looks like. Parole denial, reason number one, parent does not wish to separate. So already the parent is asserting that they don't want to lose contact with their child. Parole denial, reason number two, the child is considered a flight risk. Parole denial, reason number three, and this is where it starts to vary. USCIS IJ review, final order pending removal, that's a deportation. The USCIS IJ review is basically deportation also. And then you start to encounter children that are at risk of getting completely lost. So when, this is like their last sort of scan of where they were. And this is just from memory because I couldn't, of course, access the original documents. And then you start seeing red flags like this, like lost, deceased, lost, does not exist, things like that. And so this sort of like flattening of personhood and this flattening of data, this depersonalization, just became really affecting to me. I actually had nightmares about spreadsheets for a long time. And so in this parole denial reason number 4, that was like the decision column. And that's where I wrote this poem, which is Table Border Collapse. And this is a CSS command for making the borders in a table on the internet, making those borders disappear. Parole denial reason number 4, that column. In America, the land is a ghost of the land. In America, the land is the land of the ghost. In America, the land of the ghost in the land. In America, the land is the ghost. In America, the ghost is the land. In America, the land of the is the land free ghost. Ghost free land is the free ghost land. Table, border style solid, border style law, empire's bottom line, gross domestic product, lifespans, border style, a timeline moving forward from an ancient south, the line itself a manufactured record, manufacturing a state, dividing those who remember from those who don't, those who belong to the past from those who belong to the future. Border style, manifest, future equals forgetting. Who is entitled to a destiny? Parent, table, TD, nth child, the fates, child.value, row.cells, cell value, the wolf womb, the time wound, the dark pines shining back eyes, the shine back, the wailing woman, the strike from a man, the scalpel of the state, the cut flower, the fist in the girl, the half moon between nations, the first generation border patrol, the drawing of a cell, the coyote's den, the way out. Global values, input ID equals orphans, value equals unset. Orphans equals 5,500 initial. Orphans inherit. Orphans revert. Child table, nested, border style, hidden. Display, table cell, overflow, hidden. Visibility, hidden. Border color, inherit. Every migration is the carrying of a child toward home. Border style, family photo. Mira el piojito en chanclas, still screaming for his mother next to the man with the gun. Chiron, experts debate, a child's abject terror, abstracted on loop. A silence between sides, sound check. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Vanessa. I'm going to bring everyone back. Thank you for mapping time for us, colonial time and obliterated Indigenous memories and denied people's time. And then I think sketching a new, opening us up to a new time. So much to think about with all of your work next to one another. I think I'll throw out a question or two, and then I see there's a question in the chat. Everyone in the audience, please feel free to add your questions. Maybe I'll throw out two things. The first is something that you've all alluded to, which is the center of this event, which is what is the role of the poet in memory making? And this relates to the idea of what is memory and who is believed, and relates to the various comments on theses of memory and brokenness, and how the poet can hold brokenness, how the poet can hold silence and voice, can hold the body, the artifacts of the body. So I'll throw out that big question. And then as I've read your work, but also as all of you were reading, you're each speaking through with different voices in different ways. And so I'm wondering if you could speak about the limitations and the powers of the poet, of the poetic line, to do that speaking. And this is another way of asking, I think, about ancestors and archives and where you feel those voices in your work.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, Cynthia was talking a bit about the raw materials and, reworking them throughout our lives as we evolve. And I was thinking, in terms of your question about ancestors, what stories have been passed down, what ancestors have been present, centered in family histories. There are many who, I don't know much about for some known reasons, some not. And the piece that I read from that had my maternal great-grandmother's voice and my paternal grandfather's voice were able to be voiced because the raw materials of their histories or, of their life histories were somehow preserved, through the acts of my mother. And, there was an interview that my mother did with my maternal grandmother, but nobody can find those tapes, and I've never heard them. And I know very, very little about her. And so I guess what's interesting to me is that these two voices survived for me to put them side by side and make sense, have one represent the maternal and one represent the paternal, and somehow make sense of my identity through them. But I'm very aware of all of the silence and all of the people who can't speak or haven't left behind some kind of artifact. So I think a lot about what has remained and what has not, I guess. And Cynthia also spoke about the broken things that are made sacred in the poem. And I think that the poem is so attends to the very stuff of language, syntax, sound, rhyme, rhythm, all these things, that every letter is made sacred in a sense. And I think that sacredness protects memory. And that's all I'll say about that for now.
I'm still thinking, but I think maybe something that you were just saying, Tirzah, the thing that you were just saying about what the poem attends to. I think there's something also I love about how the poem is a small thing and it pays attention to small things, and sort of against the narratives of those and the independence struggle and the birth of the nation, which is very much also like America. And I think sometimes there's a way that maybe we gloss over how violent and traumatic and fucked up those processes were as well in post-colonial nations. Nations are nations, but that was also a huge part of it, the decision to because memory is very much also about it is about identity. It's about telling us who we are and who we are not, or that is how it's used very often in the context of national memory. Who belongs in the memory, who is remembered in what way, who was the good children and who were the bad children, and who has rights and who doesn't, who's disposable and who isn't. And I think about that, about the valorizations that can also, because I think we're talking about memory in a particular way because of the positions we're coming from, but there's also a way in which memory of the United States, a particular, and I think Vanessa, your work speaks to that, attests to a lot of that, of the monumentalization and also the dangers, the profound dangers of nostalgia, of remembering a particular version over and over again, in resistance to any kind of like incoming, information, to any new information. And it's not even new information, like people have been fighting empire and colonization since those things have always occurred. But I think about the poem as a particular, and of course, like poems have also been used as parts of nation building. But like any tool, I think it is a technology that is particularly useful to the people who are made small by collective memory. Yeah.
I put a quote in the chat because someone asked about like the connection between gender and memory, and that's actually something I'm parsing right now. But the quote is, "The world's earliest archives or libraries were the memories of women." And that kind of points to this idea of like the oral tradition. The poem, its origin, it is our most ancient memory. The poem is. It's how our narratives were told. It's how memories were passed. And women have always been sort of like the culture keepers, the memory keepers. And we see this in immigrant families, like mothers teaching daughters or people in daughter roles how to cook, the names of relatives, traditions and things. Like my brother doesn't know how to do Christmas, but I know how to do La Posada, right? And so there's this idea that women bear memory in this very embodied way, and very much in this oral tradition way, which is rooted in the poem, or rather the poem is rooted in the oral tradition. And so when we start thinking about like coloniality and the West and like what history is made of documents. History is this masculine form of retelling the past, right? The history, you have to have evidence for it. And one of the things that is most distressing to me is this problem of the missing document. Like, for instance, according to the state of Mexico, my mother and my grandmother don't exist. Their documents are missing. They were both born on a rancho. My grandmother was born on a hacienda to migrant workers, essentially unpaid workers. Which means that she was born at home. And so there's no record of her. And so if I want to find her, I have to find her through marriage, but she had to escape these abusive men. So she changed her name a lot. So my mother doesn't exist. We have photos of her, but she doesn't exist according to the record. So in history writ large with a capital H, they don't exist. So I start kind of interrogating the document, not as like this like archival form of history, but as this like grand erasure, as this way that narratives are written over and someone else's narrative control takes over. And so the people who have documents are the people who are believed, and that is a function of the state. Belief in someone's story is the function of the state. That and I remember Natalie Diaz writing something, just like she tweeted something off. It was like, nostalgia is colonial. And one of the things that I think as memory poets we sort of grapple with is this idea of living in the past and romanticizing this nostalgic view. But, and this is something I'm writing through now, when you sort of start to write the past in this way of restoring it and wanting to write memories back in and restore records, you start to author your own fiction, and you start to take on, there's a danger of taking on that narrative control. And so how do you honor the real past without victimizing, romanticizing, periodizing the past, and really just honoring the fragments as they are, and that they don't connect, and that you can't make a narrative out of them. To do so is to take on that masculine hand of history. So yeah, just lots of ethical stuff going on with remembering and how to remember through literature. So I think the poem does that in a lovely way because it embraces the dissociative or the associative memory of linking fragments together without the pressure to narrativize and make big H history, capital H history.
And if I can add to that a little bit, I think that, and there's also a way, because the poem doesn't have to be literal. The poem can be metaphorical, the poem can be analogous, the poem can be lyrical. The poem can have the trappings, all of the trappings of a lie. Right. And I think that what's also been interesting for me, as a, as a memory poet, is when there is no way to verify, right? In the absence of like, because for example, like in my own lineage, familial archives had to be like, were regularly destroyed for like Chinese Indonesians because people were being displaced like constantly from their homes. So like albums would be burned, family records would be buried and then forgotten or looted. And so there's this kind of gradual erosion. And there's like a habit, like I have this habit of like being very minimalist. Like I want to be able to like take all my stuff in like one day and go if I have to. And that is like a historical knowledge. That's like a historical way of surviving. You take what you can and you go. And I guess like something I think about is when there is no method of verification, because, and I think Tirzah, you were also talking about this a little bit about like where people have not been able to salvage like artifacts. What are we, sometimes like lies have to function as truth because we figure something out, we figure only enough part, like only one part of it, and then we have to like invent the rest or find the rest, like source the rest from like other places and put it together so that it can function. So like a lie, something that has the trappings of a lie can function as a truth. And then something that is truthful can function as a lie if it needs to protect us, if we need it to protect us. Because also I think, a strategy that is also like a really feminine strategy is to keep secrets, is to lie in order to get around the big capital T truth. Like women would pass on like stories about their lives as rumor or like gossip in order to stay in the know, in order to pass on information about how to escape or how to keep yourself safe, right? So I think there's also this interest, like the poem is able to kind of straddle the categories that have been constructed for us about what is truth and what is untruth, which is very much connected to like who then gets to be believed and who does not get to be believed. And the poem is able to kind of live in the interstice, in that border space in between them, and lean one way or the other, depending on kind of like how we want to use it and when we need it. Because I think to me, I'm thinking about the last line, like, Vanessa, I'm going to get it wrong. Like infinity is the will to survive. That was like, yes. Like that's like echoing for me right now. And I'm thinking about, there's also like a part of the work that's made me ask the question. I'm like, does it even matter? Because what does it do? Like if I call this truth, what does that do? If I call this memory, what does that do? If I call this like untruth, what does that do? Like, what does it give us permission to do when we say something is an archive versus, an artifact? What does it give us permission to do when we say something is truth or a lie? and like who is the who I'm thinking of, like who is supposed to benefit or survive from whatever technology or strategy we're implementing at any given time with the text that we're using.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great, sorry. We're gonna go 2 or 3 minutes over just so I can combine many of the amazing questions coming in, and maybe you each can just say some short thing. And I'll just add, one of the reasons that I brought you all together is because I think this sacredness, protecting memory, this maternal lineage, maternal rewriting, a poetics of the feminine that lives in oral tradition, in the body, in poetry, as you were saying, Vanessa, that's rewriting these traces, reclaiming these traces. I find that in all of your work. So I'm glad we're talking about it. Okay, I'm somehow going to bring these together and ask a question which is about both about secrecy, which relates to gender, as Cynthia was just saying, because there was a question about Tirzah, about preserving secrecy of memory and how that plays a role in trauma, in collective trauma, in holding trauma. And there's a question about materiality and thinking about objects, artifacts, woodcuts, and the documents, these documents as erasure that Vanessa, you were talking about. The relationship between the materiality of these objects and artifacts and archive and the materiality of the poem, of poetry, and these innovative forms that you all are employing as necessary means, I think, to crafting these new lineages. So maybe you each want to say just a few words about any of those infinite themes.
I can just speak to objects really quickly. I know that the question is for Tirzah and the beautiful work done there, but I am really fascinated by this new materialism sort of readings that I've been doing on object memory and like what memory, how memory is embodied in this very physical way. And, you know, we think of it as like in terms of woo, like can objects hold memory? But if we think of objects as things that have had time pass through them, or that have traveled through time to us, right? That is exactly the same process as reaching inside of ourselves to remember, to call up a memory. So whatever sort of spark happens when you touch an object, whatever sort of like comes to the surface is just as valid as memory, even if it's part of the imagination, because memory is imaginative in a lot of ways. The process of memory is an imaginative process. So when you like go to an archive or when you go to a museum, if you think of the thing as having time pass through it, I don't know why I'm thinking of Avengers Endgame, but like, right? Okay. That actually gives credence to a very feminine way of remembering, where you don't have to have proof of something, the object contains the memory. Anyway, I thought that was fascinating, and that's all I wanted to share.
Tirzah, Cynthia, do you want to jump in about secrecy or materiality of the object, the archive, the poem?
Such big questions.
I think maybe I'll touch on secrecy. I feel like I'm in this new place in my life where it's almost like you've lived enough to see the different plot lines that secrecy can take. And I think that there was a time in my life when I really believed that the secrets, all the secrets had to be exploded, and all of the silences around them had to be broken. And there's a part of me that still believes that. And I think I'm like coming into a more maybe contextual understanding of secrecy now, and really thinking about like, what is the cluster of motives around a secret? Because I do think that, even when I have experienced them as profoundly harmful, they came out of, at least in my diaspora and in my family, the secrets were kept with the intention to protect and to protect loved ones. And very often they ended up hurting loved ones, right? So I guess my question with the secret now is, or like I'm at that moment in my life where I'm asking about the validity of intentions, like in the aftermath of, I think for a very long time while I was organizing, the orientation was very much, and the orientation was very much on effect. We looked at effects constantly. And now I'm just like at a point in my life where I'm revisiting that paradigm and just having a conversation with it, and just like questioning if intentions are another, is there a material way to think about intentions? Do they carry the same weight? Yeah.
And holding at once the compassion for the motives, for the secrecy, and
That's right.
the harm that has been done as a result. Yeah.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your beautiful answers, your beautiful words, your beautiful work. I think you're demonstrating the role of the poet in memory making. So it's a very powerful thing to witness, and I'm so glad your voices could be next to one another. And there are many kind words in the chat about your work, so I hope you can look at those. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you to Vanessa and Tirzah and Cynthia. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day with some more poetry in your life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, all. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.